Welcome everyone to today's webinar, How to Manage Risk in the Logistics Supply Chain, a Plan for Resilience. My name is Glenn Patton, Managing Director of Roanoke Insurance Group Canada, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Our webinar is scheduled to run for 50 minutes, with an additional 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end. All attendees will receive a link to a recording of this webinar, along with slides within a couple of days. Throughout the discussion, we encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A panel at the right of your screen. I'd also like to take this opportunity to let you know that a short survey will launch at the conclusion of the webinar. Your input is important, and we'd appreciate your feedback. If you do complete the survey, you'll be entered to win one of two $50 Visa gift cards. So joining me today on this webinar is Mr. Tony Pelli, who's the Practice Director, Security and Resilience for the BSI Group, and Mr. Grant Goldsmith, who's the Senior Vice President of Roanoke Insurance Group. So what is supply chain risk management? Well, it's not just 4 words. It's a process consisting of many steps, and it starts with management's buy-in. Management must create the mandate and commit to the entire process. So Tony, once that is done, lead us into what the process involves exactly.
So once there's a mandate commitment to improve supply chain risk management, you'll typically want to develop a policy that states those objectives and how you're going to achieve those objectives. So some people may have a management objective of improving supply chain security, and they say the way that they will achieve that is by gaining and maintaining CTPAT certification, for example. There are other ways that you can do that as well, and maybe by adhering to a set of supply chain security or supply chain risk management standards. And once you have that set out as the objective and policy, you want to begin planning and assessing your sort of current readiness to meet those goals. So that would be a gap assessment against a recognized standard. We at BSI sometimes use the ISO 28000 standard, which is a supply chain security standard, or other industry standards such as TAPA or government standards such as CTPAT. You also want to do a risk assessment as well to gain an understanding of what are the possible threats and risks to your supply chain, to your suppliers, to your carriers, to your other business partners, and then work out a roadmap for how you're going to get from where your gaps are currently to where you would like to be in terms of compliance and overall goals for supply chain risk management. Once you've laid that out, you understand how far you need to go and what you need to go to get there. We typically see companies build out their implementation and operation. So part of that is developing the actual procedures that are needed in order to implement the supply chain risk management policies, and then training the people who will be involved as part of that. And that could include both your internal staff, but also your business partner and supplier staff, the carriers you're working with as well, reaching out to them. And then over time, we don't want to see that sort of static. There's been a lot of companies that I've worked with, for example, that they complete a risk assessment once, and then it goes in a drawer somewhere and they don't look at it ever again. We want to make sure that that's updated, so it's live, it's current, it still takes into account the risks that you're facing as those risks change. And then you also want to measure yourself against it as well. So that could be auditing either yourself internally or your external partners, and then benchmarking your external partners against each other, or benchmarking yourself against others in the industry. And then as you need to, make changes to that management policy so you're constantly steering in the right direction in terms of managing your own risk and understanding the risks that you're likely to face.
So it sounds like a very detailed process, a lot of steps involved in it. So Tony, this is a maturity curve that you've provided for us. Why don't you kind of tell the audience what this entails?
Yeah, and I think really what this helps show is that sort of overall supply chain risk management process can be a bit overwhelming. It's quite a bit of detail there, but it doesn't need to be done all at once. And we typically see companies implement it kind of in a stepwise fashion. They're looking at doing different things at different times, taking baby steps or smaller steps in order to achieve their supply chain risk management goals. And so for me, we kind of break that down into 3 steps. The first is kind of reactive. You respond to problems after they happen. The next level would be proactive. You're looking what could be potential problems in our supply chain, potential risks to our supply chain, and you're attempting to respond to them before they happen or put safeguards in place to make sure that they can't happen. And then best practice, which is where a few of our clients are, they're using supply chain risk management to benefit the entire business. So they're gaining greater visibility into the supply chain. They're gaining greater visibility into what their business partners are doing and using that to help with operational performance as well, saving money in some places as well. And that's where the kind of return on investment analysis and benchmarking comes into play. At those earlier stages, as I mentioned, we can kind of map those stages of supply chain risk management onto the maturity curve, and begin with a simple gap assessment, maybe some simple training, and then move into evaluating supply chain risk, lane mapping, seeing what risk your vendors are facing, your carriers are facing, and then doing sort of strategic audit management, maybe saying we're going to audit the top 20% in terms of value or in terms of risk of the carriers that we work with. And then moving from there to best practice, where you're really drilling in on sort of root causes, nagging issues that you're seeing in the supply chain, and you're using, software or other tools to improve those processes, automate some of them, and scale it, so you're able to look at a broader range of risks. And of course, all that's underpinned by what you see at the bottom here, which is robust policy and procedure development and performance management. You need to be able to sort of measure where you're going, or else it's kind of like driving a car without an odometer or without a way to measure your speed. So you want to constantly keep track of sort of where you are and how quickly you're moving towards your goals.
And Grant, in your experience in dealing with your clients in the supply chain industry, where do you typically see some of your clients in this process? You're on mute, Grant. Sorry.
Sorry about that. The gap assessment, I think, is probably the most important one, where clients become aware of, really their blind spots, things that have not become an issue for them yet, but that we see as an issue in the industry. So in being, reactive and proactive, I suppose, in a gap assessment, we see that as a really useful tool. The other thing I think a lot of guys ask us for is benchmarking. Where are they in connection with their peer group, both in terms of process, but also perhaps in terms of what their insurance program looks like. So we do a lot of benchmarking.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. So before we get into some details and some other topics of risk assessments and some best practices, I wanted to go over a few slides that'll talk about cargo theft and loss in North America as we stand now. These are stats obtained both from BSI and Roanoke. The first slide is cargo theft in the United States. Pretty typical anywhere in not just North America, but in most countries, that the top cargo theft incidents occur via truck, with warehousing facility being the second at 21%. And looking at the commodities, electronics, food and beverage, consumer products, they always seem to be around the top. Others can be pretty much broad category of almost anything. This map highlights some of the high-risk areas for cargo theft. Of course, what you'll see is these are the larger transportation hubs for most companies, whether it's an ocean port or whether it's airport or truck facilities. But this is a cool map to look at and kind of see where some of the hot spots we are seeing. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody out there. In Canada, again, consistent with the States, 80% on truck as the targeted theft, and then of course warehousing. In Canada, their big one up there in Canada is food and beverage, 36%. Kind of spread out over there, a little bit of alcohol and tobacco and wearing apparel. Similar to the US, the hot spot is going to be Toronto. That's probably the largest trade port between the US and the United States. And then of course, Montreal being a large ocean port, along with Vancouver. Those are the most targeted areas. Mexico, big difference here, 94% truck. Big, when seeing the 70 and the 80 in Canada and the United States, Mexico is 94% truck as far as cargo theft. And then if you take a look at the high risk areas for cargo theft in Mexico, it's going to be more or less your border cities down in Texas, Laredo, or in Nogales, Tijuana, and of course central Mexico which is where a lot of the hijackings and theft occur. So let's talk about emerging supply chain security risks. This is a big issue now, Tony. Identity theft and fictitious pickups. It's increasing, it's not decreasing, and it's getting even more interesting to see how some of these tactics that these thieves are doing.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of on a spectrum from least sophisticated to most sophisticated. And for fictitious pickups, in case those on the call are not familiar, it's where you basically show up claiming to be a legitimate carrier, and the carrier is supposed to pick up a particular load at a particular time, and then just taking the load that's not assigned to you. And so the simplest version of that is just you show up with some bogus paperwork. You're not the driver, supposed to be there, and you say, hey, we're here to pick up this shipment, this load. The more sophisticated versions of that, ones that we're seeing more frequently, involve identity theft in some form or fashion, or some kind of phishing attack ahead of time. So the identity theft ones are typically somebody taking over the identity of a recently closed down trucking company, using their sort of DOT number, those types of things, representing themselves as those companies. And we're seeing as well that it's getting more sophisticated in terms of them slapping a logo on the side of the truck, those kinds of things. It's not just an unmarked truck that pulls up. And then the most sophisticated are the kind of phishing scheme related ones that we're seeing, where someone will pretend to be a carrier who is asking for payment, those types of things. And once you click on the link, or it'll be somebody who is trying to say they're trying to pay you for something. Once you click on the link, they're able to steal, identifying details from your company, or other companies that you may be related to. So it's something that we've seen commonly in Southern California for quite a while now, past 4, 5, 6 years. And it's an emerging tactic in Canada as well. And we've seen it actually in particular in Western Canada, which is a bit surprising to us because most cargo theft takes place in the Greater Toronto and Montreal areas. But it's kind of an emerging tactic there as well. Not really as common in Mexico. As we went through earlier, what's more common in Mexico is truck hijackings, or theft of trucks that are parked in unsecured locations. So that's an emerging tactic that we're looking out for. And as we discussed sort of ways to avoid this type of theft tactic, vetting your carriers, and especially for brokered loads, those types of things, is becoming increasingly important to try to stop this type of theft.
And then Grant, have you seen any changes as a result of with COVID kind of creating some challenges in the supply chain as we see now? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's absolutely right that it's the fastest growing cause of loss in the logistics industry, especially for truckloads and less than truckloads. Where we see, I think, future opportunity in for loss vectors is really in logistics companies that are now being asked to also warehouse goods that have not been asked to warehouse goods in the past. The slowness of the supply chain means that more and more people are onshoring their goods earlier, aggregating their goods earlier. Clients of ours that have typically been intermediaries and not involved in warehousing are becoming involved in warehousing because their clients are asking them to, help provide, storage on the front side before delivery. And so those operations, which have not traditionally been warehouse operations, are perhaps less sophisticated than their partners that are used to warehousing. And so where they're not totally up to speed, where they have not had the experience of putting together a more compliant or safer program, they are, future targets for theft from both, a conveyance, but also an aggregation facility, a distribution center, or a warehouse facility, again, newly stood up in the time of COVID in order to help the congested supply chain.
Yeah, and we're beginning to see some kind of leading indicators of that as well. Just in the statistics that we're seeing an increase in break-ins at drop lots, those kinds of things, as cargo's at rest for a lot longer than it previously would have been, waiting to be picked up at or near a port. We're beginning to see two things. One is break-ins to those types of facilities. So you may just have, simply a fence around, a bunch of containers that have been dropped, or a bunch of trailers that have been dropped. And then also two, thieves basically casing those areas following trucks out once they've been picked up and sort of stealing them at the first stop, where they're stopped within 100, 200 miles, for example. So it's something that is migrating more and more towards theft, targeting those kind of fixed assets, and I anticipate that we'll probably see more of it as we've mentioned with the warehouses that are just being stood up as well.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the criminals are getting more sophisticated and taking advantage of what's going on in the supply chain. And so, we've seen, our claims department has definitely seen an uptake in losses related to theft, both warehousing and on the road. So it's definitely a concern, and we should all be aware of what's out there. So let's talk a little bit now. We know the losses are real, the thefts are real. So let's talk a little bit about best practices to minimize loss. And we'll start with minimizing losses for in-transit risks. So Tony, I'll let you take that first couple bullet points there.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is mapping the complete chain of custody, including any and all partners, anybody who has not just control of freight at any point in time, but also information about freight. And I'll kind of talk through an example where that mattered quite a bit. Because one other thing we're seeing as well is the use of insider information in order to carry out thefts. So thieves, will know that a particular container or trailer is going to be in a particular location at a certain time, and they will hit the trailer at that location. So it's important to map not just the physical flow of goods, but also the flow of information about those products as well, and then understand the risk along each lane and plan accordingly. So given the example that I just laid out, for example, we know that thieves are targeting drop lots. How long is the trailer container likely to be at that drop lot? What protection is in place at that drop lot, and how can we get the partner who is in charge of that part of the supply chain to increase their security countermeasures at that place, and which leads me into that sort of second bullet point, which is having a really deeper understanding of carrier practices. So to help combat the insider threat, what are we looking at in terms of driver and employee vetting and training? So are they being trained to not divulge information about their loads? Do they have basic security awareness training? How do they know if they're being followed? What to do if they're being followed? Those types of things to avoid those type of first stop thefts that we see. And what are we looking at in terms of employee vetting and driver vetting? Driver vetting usually a bit tighter, employee vetting maybe not so much in terms of information control. Do they have a criminal record? Those types of things. What are they doing in terms of tracking the shipments? Do they know where they're stopping, how long they're stopping for? I had a discussion with a client last week where there was sort of a handoff between drivers, but we eventually figured out that the timing didn't quite work for that. We were told that the driver handoff happened and they just went, but it turns out there was a 6 or 7 hour stop outside of Montreal, which, as we've discussed, is a high risk area. So looking at those types of things, mapping out the complete chain of custody there. And then lastly, what do their incident response protocols look like if there is a theft, if somebody feels like they are being followed, if they detect some suspicious activity, what are they doing in order to make sure that gets up the chain? How quickly can you find out about a loss, begin to investigate it, and begin to potentially recover that cargo as well? So some of the ways that we advise our clients to deal with this is to regularly audit or even self-assess carriers as well. So once you've done that kind of risk assessment, hey, here's our carriers in Southern California. We know those may be a bit higher risk. We're going to audit those more regularly, get out and see the conditions on the ground where they're holding this freight. Maybe some of the lower risk ones, we can allow them to sort of self-assess and deal with exceptions as they come up. One other tip that we've used and has been very helpful is to kind of integrate security into business reviews. Hey, anything notable to report on security? Any new carriers that you're using, have you assess them as you're doing your monthly or quarterly reviews with your business partners as well. Just to kind of make, one, it helps with security awareness. It's something that they should be thinking about, makes it clear that it's something that they should be thinking about, but then also just sort of puts it on their radar. Hey, if something is happening, you need to tell us about it. And it gets them thinking about it in a way that they may not have been thinking about previously.
So I know, and Grant, you can speak to this as well, but it's challenging for a lot of the transportation brokers, freight forwarders. They don't have that control over these carriers. Right. If if you ask a carrier what's your vetting and training process, they're going to say, "Here's my rate." I mean, that at the end of the day, that's how the business is done. So it's important, I guess, when people are going through this risk prevention program, that they have to come up with these sort of additional questions or additional things to help with this process, because it is a problem. I mean, getting a certificate is one thing, but really trying to understand the carriers you're using. And Grant, you can speak to this. We struggle with this all day long. And what are best practices?
I would say now is particularly challenging. I mean, for most intermediaries, the biggest problem is to get the cargo moved. We see long lines of trucks waiting to get into facilities to get cargo out of the port. We've seen articles last week about cargo that's getting on rail cars. The rail cars are sitting on sidings outside of Long Beach, and the gangs, the criminals can just pick apart those rail cars at will, because they're basically unattended. So it is an extremely challenging time when you're frustrated in getting the cargo moved at all, to also impose additional questions and restrictions on what is carrier security. It is a growing problem, but it's a growing problem because of, again, the frustration in the supply chain, and more people are concerned with just getting things out of the port or getting things delivered on time. And I think security just is not able to get the kind of recognition right now that perhaps we've given it in the past, because again, of the frustrations in the logistics chain. So certainly we continue to recommend that people, take actions along these best practices lines, but we can understand certainly that it may just not be practical right now to try to do more or enforce more in terms of best practices on the carrier layers and the subcontractors below you.
And that's why.
Yeah, and I can add. Oh, sorry, Tony, go ahead.
I was going to say there may be an element of triage there as well, which is kind of only focusing on the ones that seem to be the absolute worst or have had an incident or something like that, because you're right. You can't really afford to be choosy right now, for sure. Definitely.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think adding further to the challenges of the logistics community is these contracts that they're being asked to sign at times, where they're being held accountable for the actions of the carriers. So there's a lot to do as far as ensuring the supply chain and how to minimize those in-transit risks. Let's talk a little bit about minimizing warehouse risks. We've seen this as an issue. We know this is one of those areas where claims are rising, not quite at the truck level, which is understandable, but I've seen those losses increase over the last couple of years. So what are some of the ways to minimize the warehouse risk, Tony?
So I think the first and probably most important one is to implement kind of layered defense for the warehouse. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a very high-tech solution. It doesn't necessarily have to be a very expensive solution, but even just sort of making sure that there's more than just defense. There's more than just access control, and understand how those defenses are working together, basically. And think about what are the different elements of those countermeasures that you can layer together. So if it's just fencing and segmented access controls, that's great. That's better than just one of those. If you can add CCTV or alarms to that, that's kind of even better. Plus some basic security awareness training for people that are working at the facility, that would be even more fantastic. The other thing is to ensure that there's good management of contract security, that they have well-defined SOPs and post orders, and that there's regular review of those security providers. The problem that we often run into with contract security is that somebody realizes that there's a security issue at their warehouse, that it's security is relatively porous there, so they say, okay, we'll put a security guard on it. But it's not particularly well defined what that guard or number of guards should do at the facility. So make sure that there's good and regular review on that. As with the carriers, work with HR at these different sites to try to implement some form of pre-employment screening. One thing that we've seen is that this is in a lot of cases going by the wayside, but at the very least, check out references, those types of things. And if you're unable to do that, make sure that there's tight control over shipment information. So only the people who need to have the information about different shipments, when they're going out, when they're coming in, those types of things, keep that information fairly limited in terms of who has access to that information and who they can give access to for that information. I would also say as well, ensure that there's just very rudimentary cybersecurity controls in place as well, which goes along with the control of information too, because that's another area where we're seeing an increase in criminal activity too.
So Grant, I know you do a lot of warehousing risks, and it's challenging on the insurance side for sure. One thing I was going to comment, Tony, on working with HR and pre-employment screening, sometimes that could be challenging to a lot of logistics companies because they're sharing warehouse space with somebody else, so they lose control over that vetting process by that other party. And I think that's where shipment control information, controlling your shipment information and having accurate inventory controls in place is crucial. Grant, what do you think of this, or what is your recommendation?
Well, certainly the insurance market for warehousing has been reduced significantly in the last few years. The insurance industry just does not provide as much expansiveness in offerings of warehouse insurance that it used to. A lot of players in the marketplace have left the marketplace. This has become a very difficult risk to insure from an underwriting standpoint. If you're a very large warehouse, you can probably, still get your needs responded to. But if you're a medium-sized or small warehouse, you're probably finding that the market is very thin with respect to coverage. And so when you're not able to now adequately or, in a financially economically way, finance the risk through an insurance policy, you really have to focus on risk management. What we see in terms of gaps in warehousing, and I think it's on the next slide, Glenn, is just consistency across the warehousing operation. Companies that have multiple warehouses generally have sort of a flagship warehouse where they do most of their business, and that warehouse has a pretty tight operation. Then as you sort of get to smaller operations on the fringe, you see, something a lot less than that in place in terms of risk management. What we encourage warehouse operations to do with multiple locations is, have some minimum standards. Make sure that whatever you're doing for your large warehouse, you're also trying to do in your smaller warehouses, and just try to stay as consistent as you can with respect to your business practices, your risk management practices across your multiple facilities, no matter what size the facility is. We don't know why smaller facilities seem to have, a lot less controls in place, but that tends to be the trend, is that the smaller facilities have less controls in place. So the larger facilities are in pretty good shape. The smaller facilities, it can be, pretty chaotic down there. And a lot of times companies have the ability to influence that with existing policy and procedure that they're already using. They just need to implement it equally and fairly across their distribution network. It's true that as we, through COVID, move to, everything delivered to the door, that, this idea that someone's going to go to a big box store to procure something becomes less and less relevant in the supply chain. Everyone's going to expect things to be delivered to them, whether it's at their home, whether it's at their office. This has created the rise of 1 million small distribution centers. It's a contract distribution center for an Amazon. The people that are delivering your FedEx to you, if you look at the side of the FedEx truck, it says we are a separate entity who is a contract distributor for FedEx or somebody like this. There's the rise of these, million small final mile delivery warehouse centers and delivery centers. These guys generally have less, robust sort of risk management and insurance plans, because they're almost like, pop-up stores that you see before the holidays, and they're growing so fast, and there's so many of them, that it's hard to maintain, again, consistency across this sort of final mile delivery system, where we see a lot of things aggregating and where we see a lot of things that are in final mile distribution. So that's a major focus for us with respect to warehouse management. Having consistency of operations to the greatest extent possible is consistent for us, and we're trying to help our clients be uniform in their approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Tony, speaking of common gaps, you ran through this, you run through this case study for us to give a better, more hands-on idea of what we're referring to in terms of, gaps in the supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a case we worked on in Mexico a couple years ago, where the portion that you see in red is not some 100-mile journey or hundreds of mile journey through Mexico. It was about 1 or 2 kilometers between customs clearance at the airport through to the warehouses in the local hub, where they were consistently seeing multi-million-dollar hijackings in between those areas. And part of the reason for that is that there was little visibility into what the actual carriers were doing there. So the 3PL, nominally had control over this part of the process, but there was little actual visibility into what the carriers themselves were doing and their security practices, or the security practices at this local hub and the warehouse before the products were shipped to the local factory as well. And one other particular sticking point here was the control of information between the customs broker and the carriers. So the customs broker would have all kinds of information and would send it out to everybody, whether or not they needed to know that information. They sent it to a bunch of people at the 3PL, a bunch of people at the carriers, and a bunch of people at the company that ran the factory. So there's very poor control of information. 3PL did not have great visibility into carrier practices, which we found a few carrier practices that we would not recommend. And then similarly at the warehouses, there were security practices that were not in line with what we would recommend either. And as Grant pointed out, it wasn't a technology issue. It's not like they didn't have the latest GPS tracking. It's not like they didn't have cameras at these warehouses. It was more of a consistency of policy and procedure. This 3PL had policies and procedures that they expected their carriers and their other business partners to abide by, but they just had not checked on them recently. They were not applied consistently, and there was no way for them to ensure that they were applied consistently because they didn't have visibility into those practices. And Glenn, as you mentioned earlier, it can be difficult to enforce a lot of those, and especially now in the difficult environment that people are dealing with. But even just having that visibility is good as well. So if something's out of the ordinary, and you're able to sort of report that upwards and do that kind of triage on what are the worst practices that we need to address now. What we ended up doing was giving this 3PL a bit more visibility into this portion of the supply chain, assess each of these partners individually and understand what they were doing and how that all fit together, and then help them apply those policies and procedures more consistently in order to reduce loss in the supply chain. And so I always like to sort of tout our success here. In the year before we went in and sort of evaluated these policies and procedures, they had a couple $1 million in losses, and in the year after, they only had about $100,000 or $200,000 worth of losses. So quite a significant reduction in loss, just by kind of ensuring that these policies and procedures were evenly applied and that the 3PL was able to get better visibility into the practices of their business partners.
That's an impressive reduction for sure in terms of just kind of going through this process with them and helping them understand the risk associated with it. So let's kind of recap, Tony and Grant, addressing common challenges here. And Tony, I'll let you start.
Yeah, one is that Grant has already kind of talked about at length a little bit earlier, was just the lack of standardization across business units. And this is where a gap assessment can really help is what we say we're doing, or is what's in the contracts with our carriers what's actually being done. And some of that can be self-assessed, some of that can be done via audit, or even just a conversation with the carriers as well. Which leads into the second point, which is, beyond imposing requirements on carriers and warehouses, what visibility do you have into those practices to begin with, where you can begin to make sort of small tweaks, right? You're not necessarily telling them to, hey, install 15, 20, 25 new cameras at your warehouse, but at least make sure that there's a consistent SOP applied for security guard response to an incident, those types of things. And some practices that we look to implement now is just kind of review your existing policies, look for inconsistencies between your units internally or between the business partners that you're working with. Review employee and carrier vetting practices, both internally when you're onboarding a carrier, and then also for those carriers themselves, how are they bringing new employees into the business? What do their subcontracting practices look like? And then also, probably most importantly, and maybe one of the easier things to review, is the flow of information between yourself, your business partners, and other people involved in the supply chain, and review that just as much as you would the flow of physical goods. Are we giving information out that we don't need to be? Are we protecting the information that we have? Just the same as you would look at, hey, our cargo is sitting in a drop lot for 3 or 4 days, that's a risk. We're CCing everybody on an email about incoming shipments when we don't need to be. Look at those information risks the same way you would as the risk for physical goods to help reduce that insider risk, which is something that we're seeing is increasingly common.
And Grant, can you comment on some of these things?
I totally agree with all the points here. I would just say, additionally, to anybody who's thinking about expanding their business model and getting into a sector of business, because there is opportunity now that you haven't been in the past. Again, a pre-risk assessment as you go into a new operation, as you go into a sector of business that you don't have core business experience, that you're not, particularly familiar with, could be the difference between, expanding successfully and having a very sort of rough start into a new business sector. So one of the reasons that we're happy with this partnership is it allows us to, get some pre-risk, assessment and management into a process that could be the difference between getting an insurance quote or not getting an insurance quote, particularly in the static risk in the warehouse market today, where insurers in general take, a somewhat dim view of new entries into the marketplace, because they know that you're not going to be perhaps sophisticated enough and experienced enough to be a good insurable risk. So again, some proof, some evidence of some good risk management, some outside audit is maybe essential in starting a new operation if you're thinking about expanding operations right now.
Yeah, Frank, that's a great point, because obviously in the logistics world, 3PL side, most companies wear multiple hats, and they're always being asked by the customer to do something else. So it's important, those are definite challenges, and it's important to, have those practices, and how can I extend those practices out to that other segment of the business as well. So just sort of recapping here, in terms of developing that risk management plan, again, you got to start from the top. It's top bottom. It's got to start from the top, get management buy-in, and then certainly creating the policy. And as Tony said, it's constantly evolving. I don't think it's ever static. Tony, you can comment on that.
Yeah, it's definitely always changing. I mean, one thing we saw with that case study as well was that, probably a year before we started working with them, that the 3PL started moving products that were a lot more desirable to thieves than what they had previously been carrying. So taking that into account when you're designing your policies and procedures, and making sure that that's updated as well. Hey, we used to be carrying a lot of lower value products. Now we're moving electronics. They're targeted a lot more frequently and more specifically. How are we addressing that sort of change in risk? So understanding what that risk looks like, whether it's a change in the business model. To Grant's point, we're starting to set up these pop-up warehouses, or it's a change in the kind of commodities that you're moving. Make sure that you're taking that into account when you're designing your risk management program is really important.
And of course, it's all to, get to the to the end game of looking at where you are now. So this is, again, Tony brought this up. This is the maturity curve, and everybody's going to get a copy of this presentation. Everybody here will have this so that you can go back to your office and management and sit down with everybody involved in the supply chain side and kind of take a look at, where do you see yourself? Do you see yourself now being more reactive? Are you in the proactive side? Are you best practice? As Tony said, it's kind of only a handful of folks that are there without help. And this is part of the process, is kind of, how do we get to that best practice side? It's challenging. It's going to take a lot of commitment, but I think it's important at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think one other thing I'd like to stress as well is that typically by being more proactive about it, it costs less in the long run. So to Grant's point, you're able to get better insurance cover, and you're not scrambling after an incident with the investigation, with all of that, in order to respond to it. Typically by being proactive, you're able to save money in the long run, save time in the long run, and you're able to better integrate, whether it's new business models or new business partners, into your operation, because you have that framework for managing risk already. So then it's just a question of fitting new operations, new business partners, or carriers into that existing framework. So that would be sort of my call to action for everybody on the webinar, is just think about sort of, do you have that framework in place? Do a kind of quick mental gap assessment. Do you have a framework for managing risk already, or is it purely reactive? When something happens, we'll go investigate it. And then how could you take that first step towards being more proactive? Is it gaining a better understanding of what your carrier's practices are? Is it gaining a better understanding of what security looks like at your new warehouses, for example? Looking at the static risk, or is it just kind of a better understanding of your own policies and procedures to see where they're implemented and if they're implemented consistently? So I think it's really important to just kind of take that first step, and do that kind of quick gap assessment on where you're at, and where is that in relation to where you'd like to be, and how can you move there?
Tony likes to call this the maturity curve. I like to call it the cost curve. Certainly reactive is the most expensive way, whether it's retained losses, whether it's money you're paying yourself, or whether it's transference through insurance, which will ultimately yield higher insurance premiums. A purely reactive model is going to be the most expensive way to finance risk. It's valid if you have no losses, but I mean, I don't think we're talking about that situation. As you move to proactive, that's where you're again trying to basically get control of cost. You're trying to get out of the reactive mode where you're just getting crushed by events. And as you move to best practices, that's where you start to drive the train. That's where you start to become an influencer in what your ultimate cost of risk will be down the road. You've taken an in-depth analysis, you know where you're bleeding, you've made decisions as to whether you're going to retain it, whether you're going to finance it through insurance, how you're going to manage it through vendors. This is where your lowest cost of risk through preventative practices. So it's a maturity curve, but it's also a cost curve.
That's a great point, Grant, definitely. So nobody's asked the question, but it's got to be on everybody's mind right now. Where do I start on developing a supply chain risk management, Tony?
Yeah, so I've put a couple sort of simple steps here to get you started on assessing your company's supply chain risk management. So first is just kind of think about your organization's current maturity. What are you doing now? What would you like to be doing in the future? Do you have that framework for managing and understanding risks? So could you even begin to sort of understand the risks that you're facing? Do you have policies currently? Are they being consistently applied? And then consider an assessment of the organization's current strategy. So is that where we want to be? Are we satisfied with that? And then also to the point that Grant and Glenn have been making, where are we on that cost curve? Is it costing us more money than it should in order to manage risk? Look at the costs of previous investigations. Look at the costs that you've had in terms of managing that risk, higher insurance premiums, those types of things, and where could you begin to reduce those losses? And then the first thing that I always suggest doing is reviewing your carrier and subsidiary practices to assess compliance. So to Grant's point, look at that consistency. Do you have leaders and outliers in terms of, we know that this particular carrier has really good practices, or this particular site or location has really bad practices, and how can you begin to make that more consistent across your network, across the companies that you're working with, and begin to get more on that kind of proactive side in terms of managing your risk. And one final thing I would like to add is that we can definitely help with that as well. You're not on your own. We can help do maturity assessments, gap assessments, and assessments of individual carriers, suppliers, business partners, warehouses, to understand what are the sort of quickest wins you could have there. And even just to begin to have that kind of visibility, it's always good to sometimes have an outside eye to look at those types of areas.
Excellent. Well, this concludes our basic portion of the webinar. We're going to get into our Q&A now. I would like to thank everybody for joining us and taking the time to participate in this discussion. Tony, Grant, thank you. Now's a good time to the attendees to enter your questions using the Q&A panel, the right side of your WebEx panel there. We did have a couple questions come in. First one, and Tony, I'll give this to you. What elements do you measure in a gap assessment?
Yeah, so for a gap assessment, we typically want to measure against some sort of external standard. So if you're looking at more of a general management framework for risk, we'll use ISO 28000, which is supply chain security standard. If we want to look, and especially we recommend this for the pharmaceutical or electronics industry, we'll use a more prescriptive standard like TAPA's facility security requirements or their transportation security requirements. If the ultimate goal is to become CTPAT certified, we'll look at the CTPAT requirements. And so those are the things that we'll measure against. And typically what we'll look at is two things. One is just a simple yes or no, are they doing this? And then the second is how much the level of effort required to become compliant for each of those. So in some cases, we'll try to quantify that, just kind of a 1 to 5 scale. What's the level of effort versus the criticality of each of those requirements? But in a lot of cases, just looking at the kind of binary yes or no, do we meet this requirement or not, can be a helpful start as well.
Sorry, I was having trouble with my mute button there, gentlemen. Sorry. Come on, unmute already. No, that's great. We actually had a second question come in that kind of been addressed, but maybe you might add it's more specific to CTPAT. So if a company is CTPAT compliant, what kind of supply chain risk gaps would they typically still need to be concerned about, even though they're CTPAT compliant?
Yeah, so this is actually a fantastic question, and it's one that we run into quite a bit, particularly in Canada and Mexico. So CTPAT's very focused on sort of the integrity of that container or that trailer, right? They want to make sure that a container or trailer, once it's loaded outside the United States, isn't touched, isn't disturbed, there's nothing introduced into that container before it gets to the United States. What's missing typically from CTPAT is that in-transit security piece. So looking at risk of theft rather than risk of some sort of tampering or introduction in the container. And in particular, if you're thinking about Mexico, hijackings, those types of things. And this actually ties in with that example I was talking about earlier. This was one of the big gaps that we identified, was that the 3PL was so focused on the Mexico export routes to the United States, going from Guadalajara up to the border, that they didn't think about the 3 kilometers between the airport and the factory. And the major risk there wasn't so much that there would be tampering with the container or tampering with the trailer, but that the trailer would just be stolen. So I would say it's that in-transit piece where you'd want to lean a bit more heavily on a TAPA style standard that focuses a bit more on response to an incident, how to avoid an in-transit incident in the first place, areas like GPS tracking and locking devices on trailers and containers, rather than looking at introduction of contraband into a container. So those are the typical gaps that we see when you're looking at CTPAT versus overall looking at loss. I will say CTPAT's a great starting point as well, and it can be helpful in a lot of areas, and especially the new standard for CTPAT is more focused on overall risk management than in the past. So I think that's helpful. But there are those areas where there may be a lack of overlap sort of between the different areas you'd care about if you were looking at loss versus other areas.
Excellent. Another question here, Grant, I'll leave this to you. As a supply chain logistics 3PL company, and I'm being asked to get freight from A to B as quickly as possible, what's the easiest way for me to implement controls where I don't necessarily have them?
Yeah, it's a tough question.
I think more or less like, you have to do this, but realistically, it's moving fast. And I think that's kind of where they're going with the question.
I think you have to assess what you can control. So not everything in today's supply chain is controllable, but there are some things that are controllable. And for that, we look at, again, through a risk assessment, we can maybe say, hey, we're going to try to not move certain loads on a Friday. We're going to, try to drive this traffic to certain suppliers that we've been, consistently more safe with versus just, taking anybody on the spot market. So it's a prioritization, I think, nowadays of what can be done versus a more sort of pie in the sky question of, well, are you doing everything? We have to balance, moving the freight and getting it delivered and meeting our requirements to our customers with what can be done. And I think that in many ways is about prioritization. So again, through some risk mapping, through some, gap assessment, we might be able to quickly identify, hey, here's 3 areas that are really hurting us. And here are some things that we can change on our end in our practices that are changeable in today's environment that can, get us some advantage and just, work under that methodology versus saying, we're going to enforce standards right now at a time when, certain things cannot be enforced because we're trying to move this freight.
And Tony, I'm going to kind of add on to that question there and throw it your way. Another challenging part is, hey, I'm being asked to move freight I'm not familiar with handling. And, is that a situation where somebody should really step back and say, I'll take a pass? Or do I find a way to make it happen?
Yeah, I think that's why the overall risk management framework is so important, because it can be more adaptive that way, right? And you're prepared for situations that you haven't necessarily encountered yet, where you know that you have really solid incident response, for example. You know that you have good protocols in place in terms of vetting your carriers, those kinds of things. So you can take on those new challenges rather than having to sort of reinvent the wheel each time. So you can work it into your existing risk management system as well. And that's another area where I think that reference to external standards can be helpful as well. So something like TAPA, for example, is designed for moving higher value freight. So reference to those standards from the beginning and integrating some of those standards from the beginning can be helpful as well when you're trying to address new issues, new challenges.
Great points. It looks like I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think everybody that's attending is ready to move forward with developing a supply chain risk program. Again, thanks everybody for attending. Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Tony. This was the first of a 3-part series that Roanoke and BSI are doing. So stay tuned for invitations for future presentations. One will be on carrier vetting, and another one, Grant's favorite, warehouse procedures. So, thank you again for joining us today. I'd like to remind you to take our brief survey, and you will automatically be entered to win one of two $50 Visa gift cards. Again, thank you for your time and attention, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation. Everybody have a great day.
Stay well.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.